So, what if society had no rich people and no poor people? It's a question that's literally sparked revolutions and shaped entire nations. Today, we're going to break down communism, the theory, the goals, and, yeah, its very complicated legacy.
Let's just start with a really big question, one that people have been asking forever. Is it even possible to build a society without classes? You know, a world where all the incredible wealth we create is shared by everyone, instead of just ending up with a small group at the top. This single question, well, it's at the very core of what we're talking about today.
You know, for literally centuries, thinkers and revolutionaries have been wrestling with this exact idea. And maybe the most radical, most world-changing answer ever proposed was communism.
See, it's an ideology that was born right out of the massive inequalities of the Industrial Revolution. It was a direct response to a world that was splitting apart, creating the super rich on one side and the desperately poor on the other. And its solution? A complete, total overhaul of society as we know it.
So, what is communism, really? To get to the bottom of it, let's break down the actual definition and, meet the guys who came up with the whole thing.
Okay, so at its very heart, communism imagines this final stage of human society. It's supposed to be an ideal world, right? No social classes, nobody owns the things that make all the money, like factories or huge farms, and eventually there's not even a government in the way we think of it. The idea is that everything is owned and shared by everyone, together.
And the two names you absolutely have to know when you talk about this are Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. These two guys looked at the brutal conditions in 19th century Europe during the Industrial Revolution, and they came up with this incredibly powerful critique of capitalism. But they didn't just criticize it. They laid out a whole blueprint for a brand new world.
And this is the book that really lit the fuse, the Communist Manifesto. It wasn't just some dusty philosophical text, not at all. It was a call to arms. It's where you get that famous line, "Workers of the world, unite." The whole argument was that all of human history was just one long struggle between different social classes.
Okay, so how did Marx and Engels think this massive revolutionary change would actually happen? Let's dig into the nitty-gritty of their theory.
Well, for Marx, history wasn't just a bunch of random events. He saw it more like a predictable path, moving through different economic stages. You start with something called primitive communism, then you move to feudalism, and then to capitalism. And he argued that capitalism, even though it was a necessary step, was super unstable. He believed it would eventually collapse and give way to socialism, which is like a temporary, transitional phase before reaching the final destination, communism.
Now, the really fascinating part is what he thought was driving all this change forward: class struggle. He said that under capitalism, the main fight is between two groups. You've got the bourgeoisie, that's the capitalist class, the ones who own the factories, the land, all the money. And then you have the proletariat, the working class, who own nothing except their ability to work, which they have to sell for a wage. Marx said this creates a deep sense of alienation, where you, the worker, are totally disconnected from the very thing you're making. It just becomes a product that makes the owner rich, not you. And he believed this built-in conflict would, without a doubt, eventually boil over into a revolution.
So the key takeaway here is that the goals of this revolution were incredibly radical. I mean, we're talking about getting rid of all private ownership of things that make money, putting all resources under collective control, and completely wiping out social classes. The whole point of the economy would flip, from making things to earn a profit to making things because people actually need them. And, in the very end, the state itself would just wither away and become obsolete.
All right, this is a super important point that gets people confused all the time. When you hear communists talk about abolishing private property, they don't mean they're coming for your toothbrush or your laptop. Nope. They're talking about what they call the means of production. You know, the big stuff used to create wealth, like factories, giant farms, or heavy machinery. Your own stuff, the things you actually use, like your clothes or your furniture, that's personal property, and the idea is that you'd get to keep it.
And this all leads to one of the most famous phrases in all of politics, one that perfectly sums up the goal of this ideal society: from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. It paints a picture of a world where everyone pitches in with what they're good at, and in return, everyone gets what they need to live a good life. It's all about community support, not dog-eat-dog competition.
Of course, that's the theory. That's the blueprint on paper. But what happens when you try to build it in the real world? Well, that's where we find a huge gap between the ideal and the reality.
So first off, let's clear up another common mix-up. What's the difference between socialism and communism? Well, for a Marxist, socialism is that essential stepping stone, the phase that comes right after capitalism falls. Under socialism, the state steps in and takes control of the big industries to get society reorganized, and people are usually paid based on how much they contribute. But communism, that's the end goal, the final destination, a society with no state, no classes, where everything is just given out based on what people need.
And the 20th century saw these ideas put to the test in a massive way. After huge revolutions, countries like the Soviet Union, China, and Cuba all set up governments that were trying to build communist societies. And in doing so, they completely changed the course of global politics.
But the reality in these places often looked very different from that utopian dream. Critics point to a pretty consistent pattern of major problems. For one, that temporary revolutionary state, it often became a permanent, super-centralized, authoritarian power. Individual freedoms and any kind of dissent were often crushed in the name of the greater good. And the centrally planned economies, they often struggled with massive inefficiencies and shortages. At the end of the day, none of these experiments actually reached that final goal of a truly classless and definitely not a stateless society.
And that brings us right back to where we started, to this fundamental tension. On one hand, the idea of a world with no classes, no exploitation, that's a really powerful and attractive vision for a lot of people. But on the other hand, every time it's been tried in history, the attempts have been filled with enormous challenges and, frankly, profound failures. So that leaves us with a big question to think about. Is communism a blueprint for a better, more just future, or is it a utopian dream that in practice just can't be achieved?